Of all the common molecules, only water exists as a liquid at relatively low temperatures that prevail on Earth's surface. In fact, 3/4 of the Earth is covered by liquid water. Life on Earth is inextricably tied to water. When life began on Earth, it evolved first in water and existed for more than 2 billion years before spreading onto land. And even today, after life is very prevalent on land, it's only possible because of the water. Its single most outstanding chemical property is its ability to form hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds are very weak chemical associations. In fact, they're only about 5 to 10% of the strength of a covalent bond. And they form between the partially negative oxygen atom and the partially positive hydrogen atoms of two water molecules. Let's take a closer look at that. Within a water molecule, the bonds are covalent but highly polar covalent. And as you might recall from the earlier section of lecture, polar bonds involve unequal sharing of electrons, whereas nonpolar bonds involve an equal sharing of electrons. In the case of oxygen and hydrogen, we see that there is an unequal sharing of electrons because oxygen, being in the top right-hand corner of the periodic table, is very electronegative and thus has a stronger draw on the shared pair of electrons than hydrogen does, which is much less electronegative, being on the top left-hand corner of the periodic table. So this being said, that means that oxygen has these electrons more of the time than hydrogen has. And if electrons are negatively charged, then that will bring a slight negative to this end of the molecule. And we denote that with a delta minus, a partial negative charge. On the other hand, hydrogen is having the electrons for less time, and thus there's less negativity around it, and so it has a slight positive charge, or a delta positive. Because of this property, the slightly negative oxygen end of a water molecule will be attracted to the slightly positive end of other water molecules, and in this fashion, water molecules stick to each other. However, these bonds are very transient. They only last 100 billionth of a second or so, which is what allows water to have its liquid properties here on Earth. This capacity of water molecules being attracted to one another through these slightly positive and slightly negative polar bonds is called cohesion. And it's exactly this cohesive property that forms the hydrogen bond. Again, each individual bond is very weak, less than 1/10 as strong as a covalent bond. And they're transitory, so they're constantly changing. This hydrogen bonding between water molecules is responsible for many of water's important physical properties. We'll take a look at those shortly. So let's distinguish first between cohesion and adhesion. Cohesion is what we saw with one water molecule sticking to other water molecules by the means of hydrogen bonding. But what if water, being a polar molecule, happens to stick to another polar molecule or even a charged molecule? This is called adhesion. So adhesion is when water molecules stick to other polar molecules, also by hydrogen bonding. In this beaker here, we can see the properties of adhesion. The glass tube is negatively charged, and because it's negatively charged, water molecules are drawn up above the water's surface into the tube. The thinner the tube, the more glass, the more negative surface area that the water's in touch with, the higher the column of water will climb. This is capillary action. Now let's take a look into all of the properties that result from water's polar nature that allow for life on Earth. First of all, water has a very high specific heat. That means it takes a large amount of energy to change the temperature of water. The specific heat is defined as the amount of heat 1 gram of substance must absorb or lose to change by 1 degree Celsius. It measures the extent to which the substance resists changing in temperatures. Because of its high specific heat, water heats up more slowly than almost any other compound and holds its temperature longer. You've probably noticed this effect when you stay in a coastal city. The temperature variations are much smaller than we see here in Colorado because the water in the oceans buffers the changes in heat on land. Another property is water has a high heat of vaporization. That is, evaporation of water from a surface causes the cooling of that surface. We see this when someone perspires. As the water evaporates from our skin, we are cooled down. Solid water is much less dense than liquid water. This is really important when you consider a high mountain lake. Bodies of water freeze from the top down. Imagine if they froze from the bottom up. Everything would become frozen and die. But because lakes freeze from the top down, then life is maintained throughout the winter season below the surface of the lake and is in fact insulated by this ice layer. Now, very important in biological systems is water is a really good solvent. Because of its polar nature, it dissolves polar molecules as well as polar ions. You can see here in the dissolving of salt or sodium chloride. The sodium molecules are positive, and they are surrounded by the slightly negative end of the water molecule, and thus the sodium becomes dissolved in the water solution. In the same way, chloride is negatively charged, and thus the positive end of the water molecules is attracted to the chloride ion, which allows chloride to be dissolved in water. Because of this property, water organizes nonpolar molecules. There are 2 terms we need to straighten out here. First of all, hydrophilic. Hydro means water and philic means to love. So hydrophilic molecules are water-loving molecules. These will all be polar molecules. So hydrophilic, water-loving, and polar go together. Hydrophobic, on the other hand, breaks down into hydro, water, and phobic, fear of. So the water-fearing molecules are non-polar molecules. So hydrophobic, water-fearing, and nonpolar all belong together. So water causes the hydrophobic molecules to aggregate and assume specific shapes. You've seen this if you put oil in vinegar and shake it up. The oil will dissociate into droplets, but it'll still maintain itself separately in droplets from the water. Water can also form ions. Water itself will dissociate into an OH or hydroxide ion and H, a hydrogen ion. When we look at a solution of water that has an excess of OH or hydroxide ions, it will be a basic solution. When we have a solution that has an excess of hydrogen ions or H plus ions, it will be more acidic. So that leads us right into a discussion of acids and bases. Pure water has a pH of 7. The brackets here imply concentration of. So when the concentration of hydrogen is 10 to the negative 7 moles per liter, moles are a given quantity based on the atomic weight, it's considered to be neutral. That is, it's neither acidic nor basic. Now, pH is kind of a confusing scale. It's a negative logarithm of hydrogen ion concentration. If you can remember what a logarithm is and a negative logarithm, well, that's good for you. But basically, what we mean here is that something that has 10 to the negative 1 or a pH of 1 is acidic. So it has 10 to the negative 1 hydrogen ions, which means 1. When we look at 10 to the negative 2, we have 0.1. When we look at 10 to the negative 3, we're talking 0.01, and so on and so forth. So when you think of this in quantity of hydrogen ions, is 1 a larger number than 0.01? Yes, it is. So that means there are more hydrogen ions here than there are here. 10 to the negative 14, we're going to have 12 zeros before we get to the 1. So there are very few hydrogen ions. So again, the more hydrogen ions, the lower the pH value, because we're expressing it in 10 to the negative 1. And the less hydrogen ions, or the more basic a solution, the greater the pH number. So for example, hydrochloric acid is our most acidic substance we'll consider. It's very close to lemon juice, which has a pH of 2. On the other end of the scale, we've got NaOH, or sodium hydroxide, or household bleach, up around 13. 13 is a very basic pH. So an acid then is any substance that when we put it in water dissociates, drops off hydrogen ions, and thus lowers the pH. So if we increase the quantity of hydrogen ions, we lower the pH. The stronger an acid is, the more hydrogen ions it produces when we put it in water, and thus the lower its pH. A base is a substance that combines with hydrogen ions that are dissolved in water, and thus lowers the hydrogen ion concentration. But remember, hydrogen ion concentration, when it's high, is going to be a low number. And when hydrogen ion concentration is low, it's going to be a high number. That's because of this negative logarithmic function. If you understand that, you're good to go with your acids and bases. Take a moment here and consider which has the highest number of hydrogen ions. Tomatoes with a pH of 4, or baking soda with a pH of 9. Which one has the most hydrogen ions? If you said tomatoes, you're good to go. So the pH inside almost all living things and the fluids surrounding cells in multicellular organisms is fairly close to neutral, that is around 7. And most of the enzymes and living systems are extremely sensitive to pH. If we change the pH, we can entirely change the functioning of a system. Thus, we might disrupt its activities. For this reason, it's very important that a cell can maintain a constant pH level to ensure proper functioning. Chemical reactions of life, though, constantly produce acids and bases within the cells. And sometimes we even consume high acidic food or very basic food. For example, if you ever drink cola drinks, they're very acidic. And despite these variations in concentration of hydrogen ions, the pH of an organism is kept relatively consistent. This is allowed because of buffers. Buffers resist changes in pH. They act by either releasing hydrogen ions when we have a lot of base added or hydroxyl groups, or they absorb hydrogen ions when we add an acid in order to neutralize the solution. We've probably all used buffers when we take an antacid tablet like Tums or Maalox. They work to absorb hydrogen ions or release hydrogen ions. The overall effect of buffers keeps the hydrogen ion concentration in the solution relatively constant. Most biological buffers work in pairs, one acid and one base. The equation below illustrates how we transport carbon dioxide in the blood, as well as how we get carbon out of water and into the atmosphere so that it can be taken in by plants in order to build more biological molecules. The acid-base pair here is carbonic acid and bicarbonate. And these reactions are reversible, such that water and carbon dioxide come together to form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid will then dissociate into two new compounds, bicarbonate, but at the same time we drop off hydrogen ions into the solution. However, if there are too many hydrogen ions in the solution, they'll combine with bicarbonate and will move in the opposite direction to form carbonic acid, and then the carbonic acid will simply dissociate into water and carbon dioxide, and the carbon dioxide can be released from the solution into the air or out from our blood into our lungs. Although this is one of the best examples of a buffering system called the bicarbonate buffering system, there are many other important examples in biology. Pull out a piece of paper here, close your notes and close your book and write down all the properties of water you can remember, as well as an example of each. Don't look, just see what you can recall. It's really important that you don't cheat here. You can cheat once you've challenged your brain. Challenge your brain to recall as much as possible and then go back to your book and your notes and see what you can fill in. Then try again, write down all the properties of water. If you don't get it all the second time, that's fine, but challenge your brain to remember it. And then fill in the gaps. As you do this, much like when you try to remember someone's telephone number, you'll get better and better at remembering the information. Let's take a quick color card quiz. Which of the following types of chemical bonds is the strongest? Blue is hydrogen, green, ionic, yellow, covalent, or red. All of them are equal strength. Which of the following has the lowest concentration of hydrogen ions? A pH of 2, a pH of 6, a pH of 8, or a pH of 14? Write down the color. Which of the following properties of water is not a consequence of its ability to form hydrogen bonds? Red, cohesion. Yellow, high specific heat. Blue, the ability to function as a solvent. And green, its neutral pH. Next. Paleontologists distinguish rocks from dinosaur bones by touching their tongues to the object. If their tongue sticks, it's considered bone. This occurs because the water from the tongue moves up the porous spaces of the bone. What property of water is allowing this to occur? Now the answers. Go yellow, green, green, yellow. If you got all those right, you're good to go. Be sure that you have your diagramming assignment together and go out and practice by doing your Learn Smart activity in Connect Plus online. After that, you should be ready to take your chapter quiz.